Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're digging into the sources you've provided about a really disturbing attack in Boulder, Colorado recently.
That's right. Our goal here is to sift through these articles and notes, lay out the key facts, but also, importantly, look at how different people are, well, describing what happened.
Exactly. The sources give us a pretty clear picture of the basics. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The location was 13th Street and Pearl Street in Boulder.
And the targets, according to the material, were people involved in a weekly walk or demonstration they call Run for Their Lives.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the sources mention this group explicitly states they're apolitical. Their entire focus, they say, is just raising awareness for the Israeli hostages in Gaza.
Now, the suspect identified in these reports is a Mohammed Sabri Solomon. He's 45. Accounts describe him using what's called a makeshift flamethrower.
A makeshift flamethrower, yeah, and also throwing an incendiary device. Witnesses reported hearing him shout, "Free Palestine," during the attack itself.
The consequences were serious. The sources indicate somewhere between 6 and 8 people were injured. Their ages ranged quite a bit, from 52 or maybe 67 all the way up to 88 years old.
And the injuries were primarily burns. Some witness descriptions in the notes are quite graphic, talking about, well, skin burns, really severe ones. One victim was apparently in critical condition.
Thankfully, the suspect was taken into custody at the scene. Law enforcement, police, they responded quickly.
Right, and the response wasn't just the arrest. The sources detail how police and even bomb squads moved in to secure that whole area.
They swept for any other devices, standard procedure but necessary. They also looked into a vehicle nearby, something they flagged as being of interest.
And there's a bit in the sources about the suspect's background, specifically his immigration status. He's an Egyptian national.
Yes, it says he entered the U.S. legally back in August 2022, but his authorization expired in February 2023, so he'd overstayed.
Then he sought asylum in September 2022, and interestingly, was granted work authorization in March 2023, though that authorization itself expired just this past March 28th, 2024.
So that's the factual background laid out in the sources, but this is where you start seeing different takes, especially from officials. The FBI, for instance.
Right. The FBI, according to your materials, is treating this as an act of terrorism. They also called it ideologically motivated violence.
And they added, at least initially, that there wasn't evidence linking him to, like, a larger group or organization, an individual act based on ideology.
But then you compare that to the Boulder police chief's initial reaction, which the sources describe as more cautious. Initially, he apparently didn't want to speculate on motive.
Yeah, he seemed hesitant to use the word terrorism right out of the gate. Later statements called it a tragedy, unacceptable, but still maybe a different tone.
Definitely a different tone compared to some other officials mentioned, like the head of the DOJ's anti-Semitism task force and the governor.
Exactly. Those officials, as quoted in the sources, were much more direct. They used terms like anti-Semitic terrorist attack and heinous act of terror, explicitly.
So you have this range, from local law enforcement being initially reserved to state and federal officials using very strong, specific labels like terrorism and anti-Semitic.
And the timing, noted in some sources, adds another layer of context. This happened right on the eve of Shavuot, the Jewish holiday.
Some sources also frame this as part of a larger pattern, an escalating wave of violence targeting Jews and their supporters, even mentioning other recent incidents.
So putting it all together from these documents, you've got the horrific event itself, the victims, the suspect's details, including his status, and then these really varied official characterizations.
From the FBI calling it terrorism, to local police being more cautious at first, to the governor calling it an anti-Semitic act of terror. It shows how one event can be described in multiple ways.
Which really leads to the final thought we wanted to leave you with, based purely on what's in these sources. When you see such a different language used by officials to describe the same event, from tragedy to ideologically motivated violence to anti-Semitic terrorism, what does that contrast tell you about how these kinds of incidents are actually understood, defined, and communicated in our society today? Something to think about.